This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And recently, today is October 24th, so earlier this week I posted an announcement on YouTube that we have completed the preparation of all of the texts, all of the English translation texts for Aristotle's Organon, as well as Porphyry's Introduction and Aristotle's Rhetoric, so that we can begin a study of this entire system of the arts of reasoning and rhetoric. And with this video, I'd like to officially begin this study. As you can see on the screen here, we're going to begin with the introduction of Porphyry. Just to establish some context as we get started, Aristotle lived in the 4th century before Christ. He was born in 384 BC and died a year or so after Alexander the Great, which is an easy date post to remember if you study chronology. Alexander died in 323. Aristotle died in 322. So if we think of the works of the Organon and Aristotle's Rhetoric, they were all complete by 322 BC, 322 years before the Christian era, before the foundation of the Christian church. So we have these works composed in Greek, and there's all kinds of speculation about how they were produced and what exactly they represent, all of which is insignificant to us today. They simply need to be studied. Several hundred years later, actually 250 or 300 years into the Christian era, there was a rise of interest in Platonic philosophy, and one of the leading Neoplatonists was a philosopher named Porphyry. He lived in the late 3rd, early 4th century AD. Porphyry was not a Christian. As I said, he was a Neoplatonic philosopher, and he responded to a request, or at least to a realization, that there was a need for some introduction to the ideas of Aristotle. And it's very important because when we take up the study of Aristotle, it's necessary to remember that Aristotle's writings, Aristotle's teaching, was originally published in a context of Greek philosophy where the work of the Pythagoreans and the Platonists was already well established. And so when Aristotle would disagree with his predecessors, he was under great pressure to prove that his disagreements were necessary, that they were in fact right. And so we find in Aristotle's writing a great deal of discussion concerning ideas that he doesn't actually share, because he's always explaining how his ideas relate to those of previous philosophers, explaining the points that he agrees with, the points that he disagrees with. And there's a lot of pressure on him to prove his new doctrine to those who are unfamiliar with it. There's a lot of understanding of philosophy that's assumed by Aristotle because of the context in which he lived and taught that can't be assumed of other generations. And so by the time of, let's say, the 3rd century in the Christian era, one can't assume that students and even philosophers know the ideas or accurately understand the ideas that Aristotle could often take for granted. And so Aristotle's teaching can be difficult to read in later generations without some introduction. I remember when I was in college and just getting into teaching, I remember reading, I think it was in the Confessions, that St. Augustine boasts a little bit about the fact that he could read and understand Aristotle without any need of help from a teacher. And that was considered a sign of extraordinary intelligence, the ability to study Aristotle and understand Aristotle's teaching without the help of a teacher. And in that, St. Augustine was extraordinary, as I said. Most students really didn't have much of a chance to get into Aristotle directly without some help, and as a result of that, the doctrine of Aristotle was not very popular. Porphyry, however, took up the challenge a bit before Augustine, in fact, took up the challenge of writing an introduction to Aristotelian philosophy, at least Aristotelian rational philosophy, or Aristotle's teaching on the art of reasoning. And he wrote this in a book that's simply titled The Introduction, or the Isagoge in Greek. But it's just the Introduction by Porphyry. And if we go back even to the 15 and 1600s and find old copies of Aristotle's works, I have one edition that includes the Greek text and Latin translation. I'm not sure what the date is, but we'll often find, maybe always find, I don't want to say always because I'm not certain, but we'll often find Porphyry's introduction included with Aristotle's works on reasoning, with Aristotle's Organon. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, in our classical reasoning courses, I have the students begin with Porphyry's introduction. So as we get into the study of Aristotle's Organon, we're first going to walk through Porphyry's introduction so that we can wrestle with these issues, these topics, that Porphyry identified as the cause of the difficulty in studying Aristotle's works. And I often tell my students that when we go through Porphyry's introduction, this is where students are converted, as it were, from ignorant children, if they're children, or ignorant adults, if they're just getting started, to students who know what they don't know, which is really the first step of philosophy, becoming aware of just how much and how complex the knowledge or science is that common people, the majority, almost the entire human population, knows nothing of, but is the knowledge that's the exclusive possession of those who are called the wise. This study of these topics here in Porphyry change our minds. They change everything we think and understand about learning. They change our view of philosophy. They change our ability to understand things like Catholic doctrine. They allow us to become aware. And notice I'm avoiding any suggestion that we become experts in these things. What this study simply does is makes us aware of what we're going to need to understand if we're going to understand philosophy, true philosophy. And so Porphyry's introduction in my work with students has always been an experience where students transform. They go from caterpillars to butterflies as they work through Porphyry and become conscious of these important ideas. And it's as if the veil is lifted from the world and thinking of wise men, and we're allowed to see into that world for the first time and understand what philosophy is really about. And so I would like to begin this series of studies where I'm going to, God willing, walk through all of Aristotle's Organon and Rhetoric with the study of Porphyry's introduction. So if you're curious, that's why we're beginning with this book. And you can see here on the page that it consists of 17 chapters, just one book. Not a very difficult study, but there are some difficult concepts. Difficult because they're unfamiliar, because they're not things that common people think about or talk about. And so I'd like to walk through this work, and I'm planning to produce one video per chapter for all of these works, just because I don't have much time for any sort of planning or editing or organization. I'm just doing this very raw, very simple, just focused on the study itself and not on the spectacle of production and things like that. No one really cares about that when it comes to real study. So in this video, I'd like to walk through the first chapter of Porphyry's introduction, which will set the stage for us, as it were, introduce the topics that I mentioned, which we need to work to understand, which Porphyry argues are the concepts that cause confusion in the study of Aristotle's works. And we'll get a good sense of where we're going to go in this introduction, and then we'll work through this introduction, all 17 chapters, and then get into Aristotle's Categories, which is the first book of the Organon. So what I'd like to do is read the text. I intend for this not to be some sort of lecture series where I summarize and assume that I know what Aristotle or Porphyry teaches. I like, as a teacher, to always be held accountable to the text. I like students to read every word, and I like being challenged to give an account for every word, not explain things that make sense of some passages and then don't seem to agree with other passages. I like to test my own teaching by reading through the text, discussing what's necessary, and constantly making myself accountable in the presence of students who go with me to what we read together in the text. So I'll be reading through these texts, commenting on these texts, and I intend for them to be slow studies. I'm not going to prepare. I'm not going, as I said, to try and summarize or explain Aristotle's teaching or Porphyry's teaching here as if I'm the master, but simply lead students who are less experienced than me through these studies, and at the same time, through the videos, provide students with instruction time, which they need for their high school studies, so that they can put these courses on transcripts and claim high school credits for philosophy studies. So there's a number of different objectives that I have in these talks. So let's go ahead and get started with that being our introduction. And let's read through and discuss chapter 1 of Porphyry's introduction. Porphyry writes, "Since it is necessary, both to the doctrine of the categories of Aristotle and to the formation of definitions, and in short, to those things which pertain to division and demonstration, to know what genus and difference, species, peculiarity, and accident are, and since also the theory of these is useful, in a summary way, I, that is Porphyry, will briefly endeavor to discuss for you, in the form, as it were, of an introduction, what has been delivered on this subject by the ancients, abstaining from more profound investigations, but appropriately directing my attention to such as are more simple." We stop there at the end of the second section. So here in these first two sections, Porphyry lays out the subject matter for his introduction. Notice he identifies the purpose of this work. It's to prepare us for the study of Aristotle's Categories. We can see that here, the first book of Aristotle's Organons. And he identifies a number of other concerns for which this introduction is necessary for the formation of definitions to those things which pertain to division, that is, the dividing of species, and demonstration, that is, the formation of syllogisms, which we're going to study in reasoning. And he identifies these 5 important subjects and basically says these are the 5 topics that we need to study and understand before we get into the formal study of the art of reasoning. And he lists them here: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. So if you want to take notes, what I recommend is you list these 5 topics and begin paying constant attention to these topics. Anytime you read any philosophy, especially in Aristotle, and I hope that you take up the discipline of just regularly reading through the works of Aristotle, even if it's by listening to audiobooks, just making yourself more and more familiar with all of the content of Aristotle's philosophical works. These 5 terms are deserving of your attention: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. And in this book, in these 17 chapters of Porphyry's introduction, all we're going to do is study these 5 subjects. So that's really the subject matter of Porphyry's introduction. He says that he's going to summarize in the form of an introduction what has been delivered on the subject by the ancients. So he's providing us with something of a historical summary of the teaching. And remember how I explained earlier that Aristotle's teaching was set in the context of existing philosophical ideas. Porphyry here is providing us something of a historical introduction, a historical background to prepare us to be able to enter into these studies with something of that historical context in mind. So he's summarizing for us what was said on the subject by the ancients. But he says that he will abstain from more profound investigations and direct his attention to what is simple in this introduction. In section 3 here, he goes on to explain a little more what he's referring to. So let's read this to understand. My meaning, when he's saying, when I say that I'm going to avoid more profound investigations but keep things simple, what I mean by profound investigations, I shall omit to speak about genera and species. And let me just note that genera is simply the plural form of genus. All right, so don't be confused by that. Genus is singular, genera is plural. I shall omit to speak about genera and species, whether they have a subsistence in the nature of things or have an existence alone in the mere conceptions of the soul. In other words, I'm not going to talk about controversial questions that, let's say, divide Plato from Aristotle, controversial issues that perplexed the greatest and wisest philosophers to ever live. I'm not going to get into these sorts of topics. We're not going to talk about whether genera and species have a subsistence in the nature of things or have an existence only in the conceptions of the soul, whether they exist outside of the human soul or only within the human soul. And if you don't understand what that's referring to, we're going to learn about this sufficiently in this work where you will be able to go back and look at this and say, oh, okay, now I understand what he's talking about. And I'll make sure that I address that when we get to it. But he's saying I'm not going to talk about that sort of philosophical controversy. if they have a subsistence in the nature of things, whether they are bodies or whether they are incorporeal, whether they are corporeal or incorporeal, whether they are separate from sensible things or whether they are insensible things, and about these have their subsistence. So I'm not going to talk about the subsistence and the nature of genera and species. A discussion of this kind, he says, is most profound and requires another, greater investigation. And what he's referring to there is the science of metaphysics. So, for us to get into these questions, the questions of existence, the nature of things, the study of being itself, how things actually exist, the causes of the existence of things, that's to be pursued in the science of metaphysics. And that's not the subject of this present work. The present work is concerning with preparing us for the study of the art of reasoning. And so we'll get to this study, we'll get into these issues when we study metaphysics at a proper time. Getting back to his subject, he says, in what manner, however, the ancients, especially the Peripatetics, discussed these things and the other proposed objects of inquiry in a more logical manner, I will now endeavor to show you. So we see here in this fourth section what Porphyry is really after in this introduction. He wants us to understand, most importantly, what the Peripatetics have taught on these topics. The Peripatetics, if you're not familiar with that word, Peripatetics are simply followers of Aristotle. The Peripatetics. So he's saying, I want to explain to you what Aristotle's followers, those who belong to the school of Aristotelian philosophy, I'd like to summarize for you as an introduction what they have taught on these 5 topics in a logical manner so that you can enter into the study of Aristotle's art of reasoning, to his Organon, with the necessary background information, the necessary assumptions and principles that Aristotle will often take for granted. And that's the cause of the confusion when many try to study the works of Aristotle. There's a story I like to tell my students from the life of Alexander the Great. You can imagine when Alexander was given the opportunity by his father, King Philip of Macedon, to study with Aristotle as his private tutor as a boy. Aristotle had the opportunity to teach philosophy to Alexander and watch as Alexander went on to conquer the entire world. Alexander obviously knew that his instruction from Aristotle, his philosophical instruction, was largely responsible for his success. At a certain point in time, Aristotle decided to publish his teachings in print. And remember, we're talking 330 or so BC. So we're talking hand copies of works, no great distribution. But to make his teaching available in writing. And according to this tradition, when Alexander learned of this, he became angry because he felt as if his teacher, Aristotle, was giving away the secrets of their success. And supposedly, Aristotle said, I have revealed them, but I also have not revealed them. In other words, Aristotle published his works in a way that he knew would be obscure. And it's this obscurity of the works of Aristotle that make them difficult for us to study. And so we see here Porphyry 600 or so years later, writing to say there's some background information that needs to be understood before you can move on sure footing into the study of Aristotle's rational philosophy. And it's his intention here to provide us with an orderly presentation of that information. What it is that the peripatetics, or followers of Aristotle, his disciples, those who knew his teaching and who discussed it in their own teaching and writings, what they said about these topics that provides us with this necessary background information, these principles and assumptions on which Aristotelian philosophy was built, so that we can understand Aristotle's writing and not be blocked from them by the obscurity of his writing. So that's the purpose of Porphyry's introduction. And as I said, I'm going to cover only one chapter per video, and I'm just going to do this as I have time. But in this first chapter, what's very important is that we understand the purpose of Porphyry's introduction, which should be pretty clear now. We understand what the 5 things are, the 5 topics that Porphyry says cause students to struggle in attempting to learn Aristotle's doctrine, and where he intends to get the information from that will help us to understand them truly and rightly. He says that he's actually going to get the information on these topics to help us understand them from men who were known to be followers of Aristotle, peripatetics. So that's what's important to understand in this first chapter. And as we get started in chapter 2, you'll see that we just get right into it. We're talking about genus and species as soon as we start chapter 2. So that is the introduction to the introduction, as it were, chapter 1 of Porphyry's introduction. I think that gives us a clear sense of the purpose of this first study, and we can also understand why it's good for us to focus on this work before we take up the study of Aristotle's categories and reasoning works directly. So we're going to take our time, work through these 17 chapters, and make sure we understand these things clearly so that we can enter into Aristotle's works as men could have entered into them in the time when he first discovered and taught them, as if we were members of that original philosophical community that received the teaching of Aristotle. So we'll begin in our next video with the study of chapter 2, which gets us right into genus and species. And I strongly recommend that you set aside a notebook or a folder for some notes for this study, because we're going to want to make sure that we clearly understand what these 5 topics are: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. And also, as you're reading, if you're reading the works, for example, of St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Albert the Great, or you're reading Plato or the works of Aristotle or any of Aristotle's followers like Theophrastus, the writings of Cicero as well, who considered himself peripatetic, what I recommend is you keep your eyes out at all times for these 5 terms and jot down any information that you can glean from these different works. Just keep a set of notes where you're constantly collecting information on genus and difference and species and peculiarity and accidents, because you see Porphyry saying these 5 topics are the topics that, if not rightly understood, if not fully understood, lead us to struggle to understand and make progress in the teaching of Aristotle. Now, on a closing note, what I find ridiculous in modern society is how often I hear people criticizing Aristotelian philosophy or scholastic philosophy and just making assertions that Aristotle was wrong about this, Aristotle didn't understand this, Aristotle was ignorant and misinformed about this. What we can see very clearly is that Aristotle is obscure, as I said, and his teaching is difficult to learn. I don't understand where all of these modern scholars ever took the time to learn these things or carefully and completely study the works of Aristotle. Most of the criticism that we hear about Aristotle is hearsay. It's secondhand repetition of things that have been read in textbooks or things that were heard spoken by college professors or in journal articles and things like that that really have no foundation. And I think it's a testimony to the arrogance of modern scholarship to talk about history's greatest philosopher as if he would stumble over some simple and obvious issue and assume that we've already learned and understood more than he did when we have never studied his works or proven ourselves to have understood them. And so, what I would like to challenge students to do is devote themselves to the actual, honest, open minded study of the works of Aristotle and listen to the counsel of wise men who tell us how to prepare ourselves to study Aristotle and how to progress in those studies. Let's not be caught up in this modern arrogance where men imagine that anyone who lived before them was stupid, and that because they live in the 21st century and we have smartphones and wireless internet, that we're somehow masters of philosophy. We'll find as we actually go through these studies that the opposite is closer to the truth. So, what I'd like to encourage you to do, as I said, is prepare a notebook, or keep notes, and start collecting any information you can on these 5 topics and just make that an ongoing pursuit, because you see here that our understanding of genus and difference and species and peculiarity and accident is ultimately going to determine how easily we're able to move into the study of Aristotle and how accurately we're going to be able to understand his teaching. So, having walked through that introduction, what I'd like you to do is read through that chapter for yourself. Read every word, every sentence. Make sure you understand everything that's there. If there's anything you don't understand, I recommend you post questions on the forum of the Classical Reasoning 1 course page, where I and other students in the course, some who have been studying for some time and have made significant progress, will be able to help with any questions you have as you get started. I also encourage you to keep a good dictionary on hand. You know, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, if you're enrolled in the academy, we provide free access to the Oxford English Dictionary online, which is the best English dictionary there is. So if you enroll on the Study Center, when you sign into your account, on the right-hand side, you'll see a link with the login information to the Oxford English Dictionary. I encourage you to be in the dictionary regularly, making sure that your knowledge of the meanings of terms encountered is clear. I also recommend that you find a good Greek dictionary. The most common, most popular Greek dictionary is the Liddell and Scott Greek lexicon, published by Oxford University Press. You can find free copies on archive.org, or on the Perseus website. If you search Perseus Tufts .edu, Tufts University hosts a great classical studies site with lots of resources, one of which is the Liddell and Scott Dictionary. So try to get access however you can to that Greek lexicon, and that should be all you need to get started in the study of Porphyry as we go through the next 16 chapters and then into Aristotle's Organon. So I hope you're able to not only join me in the beginning of this study, but to persevere through it. We're going to move slowly and steadily within all of our responsibilities of life. But we're going to go through the introduction of Porphyry, then move into Aristotle's categories through on interpretation, the analytics, the topics, the sophistical Elenchi, and then into the rhetoric. So it'll be a great study. It'll take us some time, but I think I'm ready professionally in my state of life. I have the time and leisure to commit to this, and it's priority on my list of things that I'd like to do right now. So I'm going to commit to it and consider this our first lesson. I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, please get in touch. God bless your studies.